On this episode of the podcast, I have with me James Turnbull. He is the SVP of Engineering at Sotheby's, and we're going to be talking about organizational design. James has a great background in actually advising early stage startups, so we'll be talking about some of those issues around scaling best practices, and we're going to touch on some of his experience around working with legacy companies and talking about some of those cultural changes in logistics. James, I'm super excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Let's start off at the top. I mentioned you are the SVP of Engineering at Sotheby's. If you could just let everyone know what the company does and also what are some of the responsibilities you have.
Sure. So Sotheby's is the one of the world's largest auction houses of fine art and luxury objects. We also have a e-commerce luxury goods marketplace, RM Sotheby's, where we sell cars, Concierge, where we sell real estate, and we also have a financial services business, SFS, which has a $1 billion loan book where we lend money against art. As the SVP of Engineering, I own all of the engineering functions, essentially the build of all the platforms, websites, products, including mobile. I also own data engineering and parts of the data organization.
Well, they certainly keep you busy. You got plenty on your plate. I guess let's, I know you have a very background of working with startups. Obviously, Sotheby's a little bit different company. The top of this podcast, we'll focus a little bit more on some of the experiences of the earlier stage startup type organizational design aspects. I think the one thing that a lot of people I speak to always are asking about is about scaling, right? And right now, obviously, we're probably at the opposite spectrum when we're recording this. Not everyone's thinking about scaling, but I'm sure people are still thinking about how do you scale with maybe just less people or whatever that could be. And there's got to be some triggers of how to think about that scaling issue. And as your company is growing, I guess maybe walk us through a few things that come to mind when you think about, hey, when do I need to scale and what are some of those, factors that I should start keeping an eye out for?
Sure. I mean, I think the decision to hire, particularly at an early stage, like a seed or a Series A company is really hard. You've often gone to market to get investment to grow a company, either spend money on marketing or go to market or adding folks to the team. And so you've got to walk a tightrope of like, am I going to get value out of this new hire? And am I going to be, is this cost effective for me at the present moment in time? And am I making the right timing decision? So is this going to be, am I already buried in extra work that I need to do and this person is going to be catching up and then I'm behind on my sort of planning? So I always say to people, like, you can't predict too far in the future in any startup, but you can probably predict 2 to 4 quarters ahead, at the start of the year or whenever you want to think about it, maybe at an investment point, as you say, what do we need? What areas do we not have support in? Maybe you have a SaaS service and you don't have a strong SRE group. Maybe that's a focus for you. Maybe you're starting to think about data. You can think about data engineering or a data scientist. So sort of lay out that initial plan, thinking maybe a year and a half, 6 months to a year out in advance. And then move, look at that sort of start date. You come down and work out, I need to start recruiting 2 to 3 months before this date is due, not when this date is actually coming up, so that somebody is actually going to hit the ground running on the time that I'm going to, rather than, say, all right, we need someone on the 1st of July. We start hiring the 1st of July because realistically that person's going to be up and effective, probably on the 1st of September. So a little bit of planning, a little bit of forethought. And you can obviously wind up and down. Like if you discover that things aren't going so well, you don't have to make those hires. If things are going great, you can look at, say, are we going to expand the portfolio of folks we're looking at?
I guess, right now it's an interesting time. A lot of large companies who had done a lot of hiring have slowed their hiring. We're seeing smaller companies that are recently getting funding being, hey, this is an opportunity. and they're seeing all this talent out there. And sometimes there's got to be an alignment, especially early stage startups, right? I mean, they need certain types of people, they need certain types of thinking versus, if you're looking at people from very large companies that might have a different mindset. How does that represent a challenge or maybe an area of opportunity for, let's say, startups in terms of how they'd approach hiring?
I mean, there's an inherent scrappiness in any sort of startup environment. You don't have established process. You may have a stack that is, perhaps built on an MVP or a prototype sort of model. We are growing the stack. Growth is sometimes dramatic. So yeah, you need to think about the sort of people you can bring on board, both in terms of their seniority, like having the right sort of people who've thought about scaling problems and stuff, but also in terms of their suitability. And you're quite right. If you've worked at a very large FANG organization, you're used to a certain level of process. You're used to a certain level of coding standards, stack. You have tools and infrastructure that you may not have available in your role. And that applies both to IC engineers, individual contributor engineers, as well as people leaders, people who are used to managing managers. All of a sudden are now really close to the operational coalface of engineering. Maybe that's a change they haven't experienced in a long time, and there may be things that they no longer know about how to manage engineering at that level. So I always say to people, don't just look at someone's experience, analyze and ask them questions about how they would do things, and give them a context of your environment, like where you are in terms of maturity, what you do and don't have, and ask them how they'd solve some of those problems. If they're like, I've never had to solve that problem because at Google we have Borg, we don't need to think about scheduling or compute engines, things like that. Then you other things to say, assuming you didn't have that, how would you solve that problem? And if they don't have a great answer, they're probably not the right person for you.
Yeah, it's actually, I love that observation. I think that's fantastic. And, I do run into people, especially smaller, let's say, sub 20 people companies, sub 10 people companies where they're, the founder is still pretty involved, trying to roll up their sleeves, try to hire the right engineers. Sometimes I can see them being enamored with the name brands. They're like, we need a UX designer. Get me somebody with an style like Apple, or give me a style from. And these are big companies, big names, and you're like, I'm not sure if that person would be okay going from an audience of 400 million people to 1,000 or whatever it is. And it's interesting because these name brands seem to drive people's thinking that just because of the name brand, they will be the right fit, or they're better. And I think you mentioned suitability, and I think there's sometimes a conflict in that.
I agree. So here's how I think about it. If you work in a name brand with a 400 million person audience, how much of the needle have you moved for that company? Like what is the scope of your influence? Maybe you have a certain level of seniority, and maybe you might control a component. But the smaller the company, the more scope a person usually has over scope of influence or scope of execution over some feature or product. So I tend to look at people who've come out of that perhaps a startup world and into a Series C or a D company where they've owned a substantial piece of functionality. They've built something really cool, and they know what it's like to go from that's early stage into that later stage. So they've got recent experience of that growth, plus they have experience of owning a substantial component inside an environment.
I like the way you put that. And I think sometimes what's interesting is people don't realize that needle moving and where they fall within the scope of everything. If you were, let's say, looking at joining a startup from a bigger company, it doesn't have to be a FANG, just a bigger company, and you're the CTO, or you're the person that, or you're advising the CTO on how to sell or position that needle moving. Obviously, some people don't have experience working for bigger companies to have some of that insight, but how would you sell that, right? Obviously, moving the needle, is it an ROI discussion? Are you talking about just impact? Are you talking about responsibility? Because there's so many different things potentially to sell someone on in that context that you could potentially miss altogether.
I think there are probably several strands you'd pull on depending on what the person, if the person is thinking about, I'm an IC and I want to end up in a leadership position, this is like an entry-level leadership job. Say, if, you go from being a staff engineer to being an engineering manager in a small company. From your point of view, perhaps the risk is a little bit lower, and maybe this is an opportunity to move into a role, where you get to experience a lot more of a hands-on leadership function. In some cases, it is about impact. It's sort of like, I often have conversations with engineers in larger companies who are like, I came on board and we had X, and X really sucks, and I would love to be able to rebuild X, but there's no way I'm ever going to get a chance to do that. Well, if you're building from scratch, then you have an opportunity to have that impact on day one. You may build something that other engineers may look at in a few years' time and go, oh, wow, I wish I could rebuild that. But, you hopefully have the opportunity to sort of learn and grow from that. And I think for a lot of people, it is really exciting to own something like that at an early stage. Nerve-wracking too, but exciting.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. And I think that's I think the point that I kind of took away from that is you really have to, through that interview process, figure out some of those drivers. If you're looking at the larger company background for someone, really being able to identify if it's a fit from, is there something underlying that makes them suitable? And obviously the skill sets themselves are different in terms of the technical side, but it sounds like we really have to focus on some of that suitability, making sure we identify some of the drivers of why they'd even want to leave, RSUs and bigger benefits and all those things, because obviously they're going to get themselves into a whole different area. When I guess, I was going to switch over to talking about bigger companies, but I was going to ask you one more question about, when it comes to RSUs. And you're at an early stage startup, and this person has RSUs, and you're trying to sell them on equity. Knowing those RSUs are there is always daunting for some people, because obviously those golden handcuffs are pretty solid. How do you work that into the conversation? How do you talk to a potential candidate to understand where that flexibility sits for them?
Yeah, I was going to bring this up. This is a hard one. So the reason that early stage startups often tend to hire younger, less experienced engineers is because their risk appetite is different, right? The number of times I've had conversations with, fairly young engineers who are, like, I'm getting this much equity. And I'm like, well, do the math, right? If the company got acquired next year with, how much stock would you have? Let's say it got acquired at $5 a share. What does that work out for you as a return? And a lot of them haven't done that math, and it's just because it's not something you think about. So that that applies in the other direction from folks who are like maybe in their late 20s, early 30s, maybe think about kids, or maybe even buying an apartment, or even a little bit older and thinking about kids going to school and that sort of stuff. There's obviously no company's a sure thing. Big companies that have things go wrong. We've obviously seen lots of layoffs recently. But a company where the RSUs are actually liquid, where you can actually sell that stock and make money, that's cash in hand. And for a lot of people, I tell them, you are taking a substantial risk here, and you need to have a conversation with your family and your friends about how that's going to work, and think very clearly about the fact that you have to be really sure that this startup is the right place for you, that the founders have a vision, they have a good story. I always ask to look at the sort of numbers and understand what things look like from a revenue point of view and where it's headed. Do they have a business plan? Do they have a monetization plan? Because 75% of them don't get off the ground. For every Shopify or Spotify or a dozen other sort of medium to large size X startups, I guess, there are 1,000 that no one's ever heard of. So you are taking a substantial risk, and I think you need to be transparent with people about that risk is and what their stock is worth. And I think obfuscating or not being transparent about how big the option pool is and how that math works, and I think is actually not in your best interests. It just leaves people feeling unhappy if they, at some point in time, the shoe drops and the other shoe drops, and they're not, in a great position.
I think those are actually really great points. And I remember when we were talking about the episode and what we're going to talk about. You said something about, obviously I know you have experience with both small and big companies. You mentioned startups don't really justify needing more engineers. Obviously, with financial reason, we'll leave that aside. But obviously, they need more engineers. They need more innovation. They need more development. And we're talking about how larger companies have to look at that differently. And there's a flip opposite discussion that happens because obviously, from a legacy or a larger company perspective, depending on the industry, you have a whole cost versus revenue center component to this. And I know you've kind of seen both sides of the aisle, obviously the startup world and larger legacy companies. When you kind of then put the other hat on and you look at a larger company or a legacy company, and you look at the engineering, you look at the opportunity for somebody to come in and they may not move the needle as much. They might be more integral into some areas. How does that narrative start changing? That conversation is now the exact opposite of what we mentioned. So it's interesting to kind of mirror how you position. All right, well, you're a larger company. There's going to be things you work on, but it's not a startup. But obviously, technology is at the core and integral in everything you do.
I think it's kind of weirdly a parallel conversation. So in companies where, we talked, where engineering or technology is perceived as a cost center and not a revenue center, which is obviously not accurate. Like, I think you can't do business without technology these days. It's a trailing, I guess, that there's definitely parts of the industry that need to catch up. I think that is actually a conversation right now. If you're in one of those organizations where you are doing that movement from a cost center to revenue center, there is an opportunity to talk to you about, I hate the term digital transformation, but I guess the industry has co-opted that but there is an opportunity to say, we don't have an engineering culture. We don't have an engineering organization in the same, that looks the same as a tech first company. This is your opportunity to put a stamp on that, to build something like that. And, it's obviously a hard slog. Like, there are definitely organizations where, resistance and friction is quite high. But, if you solve a problem like that, that's immensely rewarding and it's an immensely powerful set of experience. You have to actually use influence and you have to actually use, demonstrable ROI to actually get people to make change. And if you can fall into one of those jobs and make that change, you can write your own ticket. Like, if you can solve a really interesting problem like that, there's a lot of companies that would look at you and go, "Wow, that's somebody we really want to have on board."
I like you touched on culture because obviously we talked about earlier stage startups. They need a certain type of person. They have a culture. Lots of dynamic growth, lots of unknowns, right? Being comfortable with some of the unknowns. It's not as much structure. And then when you think about a larger company or just a bigger company, more mature company, you start thinking about culture and you're like, well, does that same parallel conversation apply well, they have their own culture. It is kind of a little bit more established. There is more process. So the startup person, when they typically, the hire that's worked for 3-4 startups, when they apply to a more established company, typically it's like, you might not be suitable. And it's interesting because they might want to tackle something like you mentioned, where it's a different challenge and they're looking to kind of change things up, but they actually face some of the flip opposite of when you have the FANG engineer wanting to work for a startup. You have the startup, 5-year startup engineer wanting to work for a more mature company.
I agree. And I think that's again, comes back to that transparency and also asking people the question of like, the reverse question of like, you have all of this stuff, you have all this process. How would you make change? How would you use your influence as a staff engineer or a senior engineer to make change in the environment? And be honest about the fact that, established organizations have tech debt, both and cultural debt. So, if you give people that sort of transparency up front, some people will opt out of the process. And that's I think that's better than having someone come aboard and 3 months later go, "Oh my God, I can't believe there's all this bureaucracy because in my last job, I could just click the button and do the thing." Obviously we want to head more towards the click the button and do the thing, but it's going to take some work to get there. If you're not on board to take that journey, I'd much prefer someone opt out during the recruitment process than 3 months into the job.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because I think everybody's trying to qualify that suitability component, as you just mentioned. Either way, you don't want someone to in 3 months' time realize, "Oops, this is not the right thing. When you're looking at a company that's, let's say, a little bit more mature, technology is a revenue center, and you're trying to attract a certain type of talent, but the image isn't potentially there. Maybe I'm not thinking that, oh yeah, this is where cutting edge technology or innovation's happening, just because it's not maybe what I would view, right? It just might be a stereotype that happens, or just not what people are thinking about. How do you attract that talent? Obviously, could be any mature company that has a strong name brand in the industry, just might not be viewed as a place where you go to for technology and innovation.
I mean, I think there's obviously, you're selling on the technology innovation you do have, and you're making people aware of like what you are actually doing that is interesting. Blah, blah, blah. We're working on AI integration, or we're doing X, or, we're building this particular into this particular audience. But you're also relying on the industry. Like I think, Nike doesn't have a lot of trouble in attracting people who think the brand is really cool. Sotheby's, I have conversations with engineers who go, I wasn't really sure about applying to Sotheby's, but I really like art, and you sell some really cool things. And I thought that was super interesting. I should take this conversation. So you take advantage of the fact that if you have an interesting brand, or you're doing interesting things, then, use that as an attraction. Like, obviously you still need to be able to provide them with sort of opportunity to grow their skills and technology and stuff like that. And so, look at engineering blogs and sharing people about what you're doing from an engineering perspective, but take advantage of the fact that the brand is well known.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and I guess I'm going to ask you this question because I'm curious. I've actually had this question. I've never really asked a leader that sees both sides of this. I'm going to get your view. And Sotheby's obviously has been around a long time. I don't know the exact date. I'm sure you probably would know better.
179 years.
Yeah, it's established. Like you can't get a richer, deeper history. Like people know the name. It's synonymous with what it does. When you're looking at, let's say, a back-end engineer, right? A startup is looking for a back-end engineer. Hey, Go, Node.js, Kubernetes, all those things are kind of what we're looking for. Let's say a Sotheby's is like, we want a back-end engineer. We need Go, Node, typical same skills they're looking for. It's very, I guess, difficult sometimes for me to wrap my head around, the requirements are pretty much the same, but you still need those nuances of suitability in there, because obviously it's not just purely the hard skills. And that's obviously a challenge for most of the talent teams, for most orgs. But how do you kind of view that when you have these, like, let's say these, roles where they're pretty much similar skill sets? You could, say they're very similar roles, but they're not exactly going to be the same hire.
So I think we don't put enough emphasis on sort of behavioral and hypothesis driven interviewing. I think if someone is, and certainly we don't also pay a lot of attention sometimes during the technical analysis of this is someone's technical skills of how they interact and behave and communicate. A big part of our, we have a couple of technical exercises we take people through. A big part of that is how people communicate during that exercise, how they ask questions, do they ask questions, how do they communicate what they're doing, can they talk through their plan? That's a significant thing for us. And we also have a whole stream of behavioral sort of questions that we ask people about, like how would you react in certain situations? How do you do things? So yeah, you might have the equivalent skills, but you're asking the sort of questions that are designed to determine whether someone is the right fit for your organization in terms of their approach and possibly their temperament.
I think that makes a lot of sense, honestly, and I could see that when hiring managers look at candidates, you can see how they're trying to suss out some of those aspects and the impact. I was going to say podcast time flies, and sometimes I had a few more questions. And I'm like, we're starting to get to the end, and I won't start you down a new path. But I do have a question I'm starting to ask leaders that I'm curious about. So I was going to ask you this question and kind of get your views before we wrap up. FOMO, fear of missing out. It's sometimes, I'm sure as a leader, you're listening to the new stuff developing and all the new things that are coming out. How do you manage that, right? Now, I'm not saying you might have FOMO or you might not have FOMO, but obviously you hear stuff and you're like, hey, this is cool. We should look at it. We should not look at it. And the more stuff comes out, the more, interesting things you start having to balance what would be a fit for the company and not. How do you kind of handle some of that technology FOMO, if that is a saying or not?
I think there's definitely not exploring innovation is a bad thing, obviously, but sometimes too much innovation at the expense of other dealing with tech debt or stability or improving performance, things like that is also a sort of tactical, if not strategic error. I look at new technologies and work out what is the ROI for us, and what is it going to cost for us to take this new technology and put it into place and perhaps deprecate an old technology. If there's a substantial ROI, or it perhaps addresses a whole class of tech debt for us, then I definitely sort of, a proof of concept is maybe the right approach and we think about it. Or if there's a technology okay, this is a whole new thing that we should be thinking about. And there's a lot of sort of chat GPT style things like that right now where people are like, what could we do with this? And, I, rather than blindly adopt something like that, I'd prefer to say, well, what are some of the use cases? What could we do? How could we do, are there any forthcoming projects that this might move the needle on? And look at it that way. I would prefer to innovate on that sort of scale, strategically and carefully, rather than I read a blog post, this looks really cool, let's install it and see what happens. I don't think that ever ends well.
I was going to say, on that note, I'll wrap up with you so I can let you get back to your day. If somebody does want to get in touch with you, pick your brain on anything you mentioned, I know we covered a couple of different lanes. What's a good way of somebody getting a hold of you?
Sadly, LinkedIn. I'm not a huge fan, but I do respond to stuff on that. And I guess I'm still on Twitter for as long as Twitter is a thing. But yeah, links to either of those are a good way to find me.
Okay. We'll make sure we include those in the show notes. James, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Back again, different guest, different topic. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, share with someone else that might like it, subscribe to it, do the standard stuff. That's how the podcast has grown wherever you're listening to it. Dare I say, leave a review. I'd love to see that. Those are how the podcasts have grown. I appreciate anyone who does that. Otherwise, we'll be back again. Thank you and goodbye.